right. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome back to NCITE. My name is Austin Doctor. I'm NCITE's Director of Strategic Initiatives and Associate Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at UNL. We're here today to talk about cartel drone operations and the supply chains that these threat networks develop to sustain those activities. Now, before I introduce my colleagues on the call, just a couple of housekeeping items. Where we're not going to have a live Q&A session today, please track your questions. Send us a quick email after the call. You can email us at insight@unomaha.edu. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. And just for those of you that are newcomers, a quick word on Insight. We're the Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence for Counterterrorism Studies. We help end users tackle complex challenges to homeland security and homeland defense. Our teams provide insight, tools, and training in support of securing the homeland from violent, transnational criminal organizations, terrorists, and other illicit threat actors. So in that spirit, let me set the stage for today's discussion really in two parts. First, last year, 2025, the US designated several drug cartels and transnational criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. That set of lethal actors includes Mexico-based TCOs, drug cartels such as Sinaloa and CJNG. All of these have been identified by DHS leadership as a leading threat to our homeland security. So that's the first piece. The second piece here is that the counter UAS, the counter drone mission, continues to be a priority as we see malign actors across the terrorist and criminal ecosystems exploit these in rising numbers and evolving ways to create harm and disruption. Whether we're talking about our critical infrastructure, sensitive military sites, US border security, and other targets in the homeland, many of these remain vulnerable to UAS or drone-related tactics. And so if we put those two pieces together, we see high resource cartels like CJNG operating dedicated drone units, maintaining drone building workshops, training specialists, and really iterating their designs over time. This is a growing concern. And so we're grappling not just with the use of drones, but also with the institutionalization of their use across threat networks. The scalability, the resilience of cartel drone operations, all of these things are enabled by a robust and diversified supply chain. What we're seeing is that drones are largely treated by cartels in particular as consumables, not as individually high-value assets, so that when a drone is lost, another quickly replaces it. What that means is that traditional counter-UAS approaches that focus on detection, that focus on tactical defeat, are absolutely necessary, but they're also structurally inefficient. And so that's where we're stepping in. This year, our counter UAS research team is focused on supporting disruption in sourcing and production. That is looking at the points where cartels depend on commercial markets, logistics networks, select pools of technical expertise. And so we're aiming to characterize common and evolving pathways through which cartels source their drone capabilities and to try to distinguish some of that signal from the noise. We've been grateful for the partnership of DHS and the Science and Technology Directorate, as well as the great team at CBP and the National Targeting Center. Let me take a moment to introduce our panelists and my colleagues and teammates in this project. First, Dr. Suat Kabusu is an assistant professor of criminal justice. He's also the director of the Integrated Homeland Security Management Program at Towson University. He's a senior fellow at Orion Policy Institute, and his research focuses on terrorism and malign use of unmanned systems. Also on the call, my Insight colleague Joel Elson is an assistant professor of information science and technology at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. He leads innovation technology initiatives at Insight. His research focuses on emerging technologies and their implications for security and counterterrorism. I'd also like to give a shout out to our colleague, George Grispos, a teammate from UNO with deep expertise in cybersecurity and digital forensics. He's not able to be here today, but this has absolutely been a full interdisciplinary team effort. So with that preamble, I'd like to jump in terms of order of operations for the next half hour or so. I'm going to kick off an initial set of questions to Suat. We'll get into some discussion. I'll then turn to present a few questions to Joel to learn more from his insights, and then we'll wrap things up with a quick discussion on some cross-cutting findings on our work to date and highlight a few trends that I think will be important to watch in the coming months in this space. So Suat, you've led our really original data analysis in this space, looking at operational trends, particularly related to cartels in Mexico. And that's really where I want to start. Give us that baseline. Help us put this discussion in context. Where do you situate cartel drone use within the broader trends that we're seeing worldwide?
Yeah, of course. And thanks a lot for organizing this event, and thanks to NCITE. And as also you eloquently described, that drones are not no more at the periphery of conflicts. They are game changers. They are at the central in the conflicts, especially as we see between war in Ukraine and Russia. And when it comes to non-state actors, so when we look at the data available in the open sources, we observe a significant increase of drones. And we see that air power is no longer monopolized by states. So the state hegemony in the air domain is pretty much evaporated with these, especially small drones. So when we compare non-state actors, comparing terrorist groups, FTOs, and then cartels, especially with the adaptation, we see that terrorist organizations started experimenting with drones in mid-2010s with ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates, as we see in Iraq, in Mosul, and they use for propaganda activities, for videotaping their operations and using in social media videos. They also use a kind of delivering explosives and payloads. But also we see Iran-backed groups with Hezbollah, Houthis, that actually has the luxury of access to military-grade drones through state sponsors, and then intermediaries that has higher payload. Houthis can target Israel going over 1,200 miles. So that's pretty much a different landscape. And they adapt this technology. They have become the pioneer of these standoff attacks by using drones. So when it comes to cartels, especially Mexican cartels, we see they started to use drones in mid-2010s for intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance, especially for smuggling and for the payloads. When it comes to weaponization, we see the early incidents that happen in early 2020s with CJNG, which is the pioneer of drone adaptation among these cartels. And what we see that even they started later on the terrorist groups like FTOs, they pretty much actually adapt this technology in a rapid pace. They compress the learning curve in weaponizing such drones. So there are some factors because they mostly use commercially available drones. And then we see from some reports, some FTO groups like park members that actually help them to adapt in this technology. There are some reports that actually they sent their members to Ukraine by joining the International Legion to get kind of the field experience. So when we look at the global trends overall, in the last 6 years, we identified 221 drone-involved attacks by cartels. And CJNG and the La Familia is the most frequent users of drones. There are other incidences that the ACDET data, for example, they cannot identify who the perpetrator is, but they are related to specific criminal groups and the cartels. And overall, when we compare cartel use with the FTO use, cartels make around roughly 13% of drone-involved attacks by looking at these two categories.
That's really helpful. I'm wondering if you could flush that out a little bit, just operationally speaking. What is it about drones? Why do they fit so well with what cartels need, just in terms of function and incorporating them into their broader operational profiles?
I think Answer is easy, like it's accessible, more accessible, and it's useful. Especially when you look at cartels, they are using mostly commercial or the counter drones or custom built drones. So you can order from Amazon or eBay, even you can buy from the retailer stores. So they are affordable, becoming more affordable, more capable. They are easy to use with these old softwares, right? I mean, I started to use drones in 1 hour, so it's really effective. So even I cannot crash it, even I want it. Um, so when we look at the usefulness, it's a kind of a rational choice for the cartels. So, they can bypass the traditional two-dimensional physical security measures like fences, and they're pretty much effective, especially by using cheap drones, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, right? And then they're effective in smuggling drugs, weapons, and illicit goods. And also we see that, with the uh, customizable drones, you can actually easily weaponize these technologies. And on the other side, it is lower cost for operators, right? It's a kind of without less risk for the perpetrators, and also they can be involved in precision strikes. So, and what we see with the cartels, they can create so much higher psychological impact, especially over communities. They try to kind of depopulate so they can control the territories. And also it's a reputational signaling. So it can actually outbid other competitor rivals. So that is a good reputation for such organizations.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm just in terms of sort of tactical insight, operational insight, there's so much I think that we can learn, particularly in the drone space, looking at the types of targets that tend to be on the endpoint of these operations. I'm thinking specifically of those kinetic functions. What are we seeing by way of targeting patterns here with cartel
Mm-hmm.
drone use? How do those compare to other violent non-state actors?
So when we compare CGNG and La Familia with other groups, what we see that civilians are primarily the targets. Over 60% of their drone attacks targeted communities and civilians, but also they target rival groups. But also we see a kind of trend that these groups becoming much more paramilitary groups, started to target Mexican military and police. That is a kind of trend with CGNG. And when we compare cartel use of drones, especially with the FTOs, especially with the Iran-backed groups, they are mostly targeting state forces, security infrastructure, especially the U.S. military installations, and also like critical infrastructure in Saudi Arabia. So the cartel target type is pretty much different, and it's focusing on much more civilians and rival cartels. However, the trend is becoming much more paramilitary and going after state forces.
You mentioned just now sort of this paramilitary approach, and then earlier reference some of the Iranian-backed groups, some of which have begun to use or have used historically more military-grade systems. A lot of our news feeds are also filled with reports of violent non-state actors, whether it be insurgents, terrorists, or otherwise, using these more commercial off the shelf systems. What does this look like in the cartel space? What are the types of drones and weaponization methods that we're seeing them adopt and employ? Suat, did you catch that?
Okay, I have a connection issue. So I think you were asking about the type of drones that were used by cartels. Am I
That's right.
correct, Austin? Okay, sorry for missing that.
No worries.
And what we see with our kind of investigation of the drone types that were used by cartels, looking at the social media posts and looking at the government reports, what we see that they are pretty much relying on commercial drones like quadcopters. And then now there's a kind of trend to adopt the FPVs. These are mostly kind of custom built drones. And when we look at the make and models, what we see DJI Mini drones, which is kind of the micro drones that can be used for intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance. And we see like DJI Mavic, it's relatively larger that can be used for payloads, which is not more than 1 kilogram. And then we see other larger drones, again, DJI Matrix, DJI Flycarts for heavier payloads. I mean, these drones can be used also for smuggling, not for delivering explosives. And also there's a trend that they use affordable first-person view, custom-built drone kits. And they are using some rudimentary weaponization methods like using plastic tapes, bottles, and then some improvised release mechanisms. And also there is a kind of trend, especially with CGNG, they're experimenting with one-way kamikaze style drone attacks. So that's something concerning. And overall, what can I say is that, cartels primarily are relying on commercially available drones, whether it's a small or medium size. I think that's pretty much different than what we see with the state-sponsored organizations like Houthis and Hezbollah. However, they are pretty much similar to the organizations like ISIS affiliates or Al-Qaeda affiliates, who doesn't have any kind of state sponsors, so they can also rely on this kind of drones.
Okay, that's a really good transition now to our technology and innovation lead. Thinking about the hardware and in some cases even the software sides of this problem set. Joel, just a few questions in this piece of the problem set. What are some of the critical ways that we're seeing the UAS or the drone technological ecosystem shift? What has that meant for the ways that we should understand and even anticipate some of the emerging trends in their use by this set of threat actors?
Yeah, thanks, Austin, for that question, and Suat for really teeing this conversation up. When we're talking about shifts in the UAS ecosystem, the most important change isn't just better drones. It's actually a structural shift in how capability is being realized. So we're increasingly seeing that this ecosystem is being organized around devices, components, and what we are calling parasites. And so maybe I'll just step through those three things in a little bit. So devices are those COTS, those complete off-the-shelf systems, consumer or prosumer drones. And they're being adopted because they're increasingly affordable, they're increasingly capable, fantastic new functionalities, and probably very importantly, they're very reliable. So for militant actors, off-the-shelf devices really lower that barrier to entry. They reduce the technical expertise required. They have immediate operational utility. And these trends might help to explain why we're starting to see this rapid uptake and diffusion across groups and geographies around the globe. So basically, the second group or category of things I've mentioned here are components. And this is where customizations and optimizations to these different flight systems occur. So we're talking about motor upgrades, things like new propellers to be more silent or produce more lift, a whole array of sensors, flight controllers, batteries. These things allow for increased range, increased payload, and they also uniquely kind of offer an opportunity for analysis as they start to create signatures for different groups and people. So just as an example, in Ukraine and elsewhere around the globe, we started to see, fiber optic spools being used to navigate kind of denied airspaces. And so over just the course of innovation and adoption, we've now started to see the cartel use of these same technologies. Components let militant groups really tune their drones to their specific missions. And this is what the components mean in kind of our context. And the last one there that I mentioned is parasites. And these are these whole new add-ons that really exploit existing platforms. And this is where I'm really excited because we're seeing so much innovation. So a parasite itself is an attached unit, and it can contain its own software, its own firmware, and even its own payload. And so for this, for a lot of these existing drone systems and drone platforms, they're not necessarily able to be modified to the extent that a parasite is. And you can attach that to any different drone system and really allow for this unique scaling and flexibility between platforms. And so we're really seeing this these parasites come into play with weaponization, ISR enhancement. Um, Really, what this means is tracking emerging technology trends, Austin. This is what tells us what the next technical leap is likely to occur, even if the airframe itself doesn't change.
And that's actually, yeah, that's a perfect transition to my next question, which is, I mean, we've set this baseline of sort of how these devices and related technologies can be configured and understood across these different types. But on the very forward edge of this, what are the sort of related emerging technologies that we should be watching most closely in the UAS space, in the Cartel drone program space? What does this mean for the next generation, the next round of innovations in Cartel?
Yeah, just two examples of this are new communications technologies and AI. Together, these things are really force multipliers. Advances in AI and connectivity, they're collapsing distance, expertise, and that risk for the actor and flight operators themselves. So the first of these communication technologies that I want to just highlight are global connectivity of UAS platforms via LEO or low Earth orbiting satellites. So these LEO satellites, allow for remote access to drone systems, remote control, deployment, coordination, and things like that. And they're starting to have global reach. So the operator does not necessarily need to be located in proximity to the drone or UAS itself, right? And control can be completely distributed or outsourced even, right, to a better pilot if needed. I think this fundamentally changes things like attribution, how we go about disrupting these flights, and even deterrence. This actually harkens back to some of the work that we wrote last year in our report defining the logic of terrorist use in UAS systems. And one of the quotes that I have for us here is that through technologies such as low Earth orbit satellites, remote drone stations can be accessed via the internet, enabling global reach. And what's really fascinating is we are starting to see what we wrote about last year already taking place in OSINT. We're seeing evidence of these low Earth orbit satellite enabled drones already. And the second piece that we wanted to mention was AI enabled autonomy. And so AI reduces the dependence on skilled human operators kind of across the board, right? So for navigation and piloting, it has autonomous navigation, obstacle avoidance, being able to completely execute a mission from takeoff to mission success, right? AI can be integrated in that capacity. Obviously this has ramifications because it's lowering the barrier of entry, the expertise needed to pull off certain types of missions, and even what is on the plate, what is the realm of possible for types of missions. That complexity can be exponentially increased. I think AI and this communications really pair naturally as being something to be aware of in the future, right? A key kind of like takeaway thing might be humans in the future can be out of the loop. They don't necessarily just have to be human in the loop. And so that's really, I think, key.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. And just thinking about, I mean, the foundation that SUAT set for the operational piece, what you've just said about the tech piece, this project is also focused on looking further upstream, right? So what does this look like with regards to supply chains? Why is understanding the tech that enables these tactics and the related commercial market trends important to then shaping how we characterize those related malign supply chains?
Yeah, really great question there, because in my perspective, the malign UAS supply chains don't exist independently. They're really embedded within these commercial ecosystems, right? Technology that is coming out that really defines the capability ceiling. Commercial technologies, for example, they're reaching new performance thresholds. They're allowing for modularity for components to be swapped in and out. Their capability oftentimes includes attachment points and things to allow for easy modification. I think, as we start to attribute militant innovation, what we're actually seeing is we're seeing inherited innovations that have been driven by the market. So I think from at least my perspective, if we don't understand the technology in the market, right, we might be being able to misread intent and capability of innovation and things like that, and risk that different groups offer. So I think commercial markets, they're offering a few important things. They're offering, what new flight systems are available. They're increasingly, as Suat has mentioned a few times here, they're increasingly more affordable. And it makes, substituting systems more replaceable. So this is really, I think, really, really key. Um, the markets themselves also can be seen as these early leading indicators. So as we start to see new product releases, new firmware updates, right, we can potentially say that these are reshaping adversarial malign use possibly faster than UAS policy in any given region, right? So it's this market that's allowing us to anticipate capability adoption, identify future choke points. This is why we're treating FTO drone programs as a supply chain ecosystem and not just a weapons system.
Yeah, no, it's a great word. And I mean, you and I, all of us, have spent a lot of time thinking about this, talking about this, but just as a quick level set, what do we mean by supply chains? Can you talk a little bit about this original novel framework that we've developed to characterize and map the ways that terrorists and cartels are sourcing their UAS capabilities?
Yeah, happily too. And we're really looking forward to having more of these deliverables in print and being able to share and disseminate this in greater detail. But I'll do my best to describe it visually through words, and hopefully people can follow along with this framework. So first and foremost, when we say supply chain, we're talking about that end-to-end system that turns intent into operational capability. So our team has adopted the supply chain operations reference framework, which is a well-established tool in the supply chain management literature. And we've adopted it for the MCORE, or malign supply chain operations reference, as it pertains particularly to UAS. And this is going to enable researchers and policymakers to systematically identify and map out those hardware and software flows, information exchanges, key processes, actors, all within the adversarial network, supply chain network. So the MCORE model itself, as we've defined it, it really is consisted of four key categories of processes: plan, enable, source, and make, or enable, source, make, and deliver. And these meta processes, plan and enable, with intermediary checkpoints in between them, because sometimes at different parts of the process, you could actually skip ahead if the existing operational capability is possessed. So you don't necessarily have to go through this entire model. But I'm going to walk us through these different pieces, starting with those meta processes, and then going through those core processes. So the meta processes obviously expand for the whole supply chain. And this is planning. Planning occurs at every phase of the supply chain. And it's really determining things like logistical pathways for all of the other processes and categories. Something that differentiates, the malign model here from traditional models is that in conventional supply chains, these activities can occur out in the open. Whereas with this malign use, secrecy is paramount at times. Often there's these dual sourcing of sources to get parts for multiple reasons, and this distributed assembly network in order to have some resiliency, or perhaps just out of necessity, in order to acquire the parts that are needed. And so that's something to keep in mind, is planning is going to be occurring throughout the entire supply chain. And the second meta process that underpins everything is this enabling phases. And so these are all of the efforts to do financing, communicating, and coordinating across the supply chain to connect the suppliers, the builders, and the operators. In our model, this enabling phase also includes things like knowledge sharing, and that's like digital repositories, digital design manuals, things like that. Looking at the four key processes, and so just taking it one step at a time, we begin all of the supply chains with sourcing. And at the source stage, what we're really looking to do is capture how cartels and other organizations, how they're obtaining that hardware, that software, and those other digital components that form the base of that UAS capability. Sometimes, like we mentioned before, this is the acquisition of complete consumer drones, but sometimes this is just individual components, motors, sensors, a battery, a controller, or even software elements, right? So that they can conduct mission planning, things like that. Sourcing strategies, as we're seeing in the cartel, they often blend legal, gray market, and illicit methods, right? Including traditional retail purchases, online marketplaces, and cross-border smuggling. All of this is at play when we're coming to cartel. So that's the first major block, right? Is sourcing. The second block, if all the capabilities for the mission are not achieved at that source stage, there's this opportunity for customization or creation. I call this the make stage. This really is that transformation of the sourced materials into operational capacity. So we can think of this as like maybe assembling parts from components, or maybe modifying in order to extend the range or add payload capacity, possibly weaponizing payloads, or updating or alternating the firmware and control software. In more sophisticated instantiations, this could also be like 3D printing or the custom creation of specific parts or release mechanisms, right? And so this is all occurring here in that second block, that make phase. There's another intermediary checkpoint where we say, is this device operational? And if so, it goes ahead and proceeds on to what I'm calling the deliver stage. And if not, it can loop back and re-go through the sourcing and the making stages again. So with the delivery stage, really this is at high level. It's the logistics of moving these complete UAS capable systems into operational use, right? And so there's logistics to conceal them, to smuggle these things so that they can be deployed in the field. We can think of transport vehicles or maybe staged areas where these will be ready for deployment with remote operation. But this is this kind of concluding stage here is delivery, which leads finally then after a UAS is able to be used, we have something called the return stage in our model. And this is about that information that comes back. Sometimes it's more than information that comes back. Sometimes it's the recovered drone or salvaged or usable components from either a successful or a failed mission, so that those parts can be reintegrated into the kind of collection of parts available in the earlier stages. But a lot of times that physical recovery is not possible. And so in those cases, what we're seeing is it's insights so that innovation can continue to occur. New lessons learned can be applied, and expertise and kind of capability can be honed over time, right? I'm trying to think if there's anything else here to really dive into, but I think really, in summary, at every stage in our MCORE model here, it presents a different opportunity for intervention. Yeah, if we want to, disrupt military drone use, we need to disrupt the systems that make it repeatable, not just the drone itself in the air.
Yeah, Joel, and I think we found, that one of the key advantages of that framework is really the comparability, right? And that by using the same framework, we can actually analyze the drone programs of groups like CJ&G, other cartels, and other traditional terrorist actors side by side, and identify where those shared TTPs are, those tactics, techniques, and procedures, as well as where there may actually be unique sourcing or build and construction modification habits across those regions. Thinking about,
Right.
okay, what are those common mods? What do we see clear signatures behind the use of certain models or attachments? Each of those steps, right, gives us a technical signature that can be identified and exploited. The entire point here being that further upstream disruption. So I'd like to put some of these pieces together here. You know, a core part of our work is understanding how the various cartel drone programs show similar and distinct operational patterns. There's actually a lot of variation here, and we don't want to black box this or treat the cartel drone problem set as sort of a monolith, because there are implications, unique implications for how they develop their supply chain in terms of sourcing and production. So, Suat, I'm wondering, based off the work that really you've led and that we've done, what differences are we seeing across cartel use of drones in the ways that they've adapted these technologies?
Yeah, so when excuse me, we look at non-state actors, you know, you're not comparing apples and apples. There are different varieties of groups here, especially focusing on Mexican cartels. Our understanding of the operational frequency and consistency really matters in understanding the quality and the quantity of supply. So especially with cartels and the gangs in Mexican context, when they use drones episodic, right, using once in a year or, you know, twice in a year, they don't really need a kind of sustained supply chain. They just use ad hoc sourcing. But when we look at groups like CJNG, we see kind of consistency. So they really need a kind of reliable and repeatable supply chains. So this is where, you know, there are reports about their workshops and how they use intermediaries to smuggle drones into the country. So this pretty much kind of similar to my previous research on Houthis. So we look at, you know, where do they get their drones? I mean, using Iranian kind of intermediaries to be able to get smuggled drones into the country. So this is where we need a kind of professionalism and training pipelines, you know, just working on their drone units. And also they look at to diversify their platforms, not relying on just one kind of model, but also using custom-built drones. And also they try to standardize their payload systems. So I think it's important to understand the frequency and consistency to be able to, you know, estimate what kind of supply chain they need.
Thanks, Scott. And I'm wondering, you know, we've looked closely, for example, in our work at CJ&G, we've also looked at La Familia, Michoacana. I'm wondering, you know, these are two very different groups, different levels of capability, even bases of operation. What are we seeing there, just by way to sort of flush this out operationally in terms of sourcing and production between these two cartel networks?
Yeah, CJNG is, you know, is the central driver and the pioneer of drone adaptation among these Mexican cartels. So they have dedicated drone operators, operadores, droneros. They have their patches. And also, when we look at their operations, initial attacks mostly in central west states like Michoacana, Guerrero, and Jalisco. Now we see some gradual expansion into border states and some activities close to the US border. And also what we see that with CGNG, you know, they are targeting towards state forces, the military, and then their potential signaling for cross-border targets, you know, targeting US, but this is again, you know, likely still signaling. When it comes to La Familia, what we see with La Familia is much more episodic. We don't see so much consistency in their drone use. And also their violent activities is relatively less than CJNG. But interestingly, you know, in March 2024, they actually conducted a 72-hour drone campaign against the civilians, against multiple cities, villages, and they dropped more than 40 explosives for the purpose of civilian intimidation and forced displacement. So there are like different flavors of cartel drone use, and there are other groups as well, but they are not as frequent as La Familia and CGNG.
Can you elaborate a little bit? What are some of the trends that we're seeing in terms of their use across these groups? What should we be watching on the operational side of this issue?
Joel mentioned about these kind of new technologies, AI, autonomous systems. On the other side, when we look at the field, what we see, there is a trend towards the first-person view drones, which is more affordable, which is much more customizable, and also it's pretty much effective for one-way attack drones. So there is a kind of weaponization trend that actually can provide much more precision strikes, brutality, and it aligns with their much more paramilitary type of tactics. And also, it's especially with the CGNG, it's much more institutionalized drone programs. So they show some professionalism, some training pipelines, and diversification of drones. And as we look at their payload systems, the modification is becoming much more standardized rather than being rudimentary. And also, another concerning for our homeland is what we see, the drone attacks from cartels is getting closer to the US border in October 15, 2025. So there were one drone attack against Baja California Attorney General's office. So it is pretty much close to the US border. But when we look at the overall trend and earlier incidents that were pretty much, in central states of Mexico, now we see a kind of expansion of drone use to other places, especially weaponization of drones.
Thanks, Scott. As we're nearing sort of the conclusion here, I want to carve out a little bit of time to just put some of these pieces together as it relates to the operational profiles that we're seeing, the technology trends, the technological trends that are enabling and sustaining that, and the unique sourcing and modification supply chain pieces, right? Because they're directly connected. And just to highlight something I heard from both of you, first is as it relates to sourcing is the likelihood that yes, we are seeing widespread use and general adoption of commercial off-the-shelf systems, but that's moving in a way where we're seeing a larger proportion or growing proportion, I should say, of use of first-person drones and some of those related build kits, right? Where they're increasingly inexpensive, they're fast, they're precise. We've seen CJ&G pioneer their use. We know Sinaloa is there as well. And speaking to that compression of timeline, we're seeing adoption and deployment within several months. That's a fast diffusion cycle. And I think as we're looking at these FPVs, these first-person view drones, simultaneously, you both mentioned this, we're seeing expecting to see fiber optic used sort of as this right command and control solution as a potential space for growth, particularly in areas where security forces and even other cartels are showing strong counter UAS capabilities, strong jamming capabilities. A second thing that I heard here is sort of this as it relates to sourcing and technology is a growing appetite for the capabilities that come from some of these more heavy lift or industry platforms, right? Where we're already seeing cartels repurposing agricultural drones, cargo drones. They're capable of carrying a lot more weight. They're capable of operating in many instances for longer periods. And so as we expect to see this segment of the market to grow even locally within Mexico and certainly globally, we expect, right, that we should be looking for various ways that they're being modified to support weaponization and smuggling and ISR operations. The last piece here that I think is important to take note, we talked by way of sourcing through purchase, going to brick and mortar retail stores, leveraging e-retailers and intermediaries to connect cartel drone operators to these commercial systems. They really haven't had a need at this point to use theft, right, as a primary means of sourcing their drone capabilities. But I do think this is something our work has shown that we should at least be looking for, or at least to track the potential for a rising risk of theft, particularly of those more sophisticated difficult to access platforms. Simultaneously, we're seeing some Mexican security forces adding attack drones or drones more broadly into their arsenals and their TTPs. Those are the types of systems that also might be ripe for theft, not as a substitution for purchases, right, through various legal and illicit mechanisms, but as a means of diversification. As we see these drone programs in different cartel groups continue to scale. Something else just to flag here as it relates to broader trends is that just to underscore the deeply decentralized nature of sourcing and even modification that we're seeing in a lot of these cartel drone programs. You know, if we look at operations near the US southern border, many drone operators seem to be sourcing their own systems, either through international intermediaries in Mexico or even just across the US border. And then they're testing and modifying in very small groups or independently. Their primary use in this case, right, are commercial off-the-shelf drones largely focused on supporting ISR intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance functions, maybe some drug smuggling operations. But the scale of this is significant and causing an operational and even strategic effect. If we're looking at just basic or public numbers available from DHS, we're talking about tens of thousands of drone flights observed near the border just in the past year. Each of those operations are supported by thousands of unique individual drone units. And I think that really reflects the fact that there are relatively few limitations. If we're comparing drones to, say, the acquisition of firearms, for example, there are relatively few limitations to what these operators can actually source through relatively normal retail means. Now, then we need to pivot, right? Because if you go further into the interior, meaning further within Mexico, we see a relatively higher level of centralization in the sourcing and modification of devices. And I think that's also the result of there being a need to support different operational functions. That includes explosive attacks, like you were mentioning, Suat. The size of some of the multiple drone workshops that we've seen uncovered by Mexican law enforcement and security forces in states like Michoacan indicate that cartels are institutionalizing some resilience here to those occasional seizures and to those occasional disruptions by spreading out some of their production chains in that stage that you mentioned, Joel, that modification and assembly stage of production. And so just to build on that and also to conclude here as we're nearing the end of our time with some food for thought, it is just a reflection that cartel drone programs and their supply chains aren't one size fits all, even within the same cartel network or enterprise. They have a strong geographic character. There are different supply chains and sourcing needs for cartel units operating, for example, deeper in the country versus those that are primarily operating out of plazas near the US southern border. They'll likely have overlapping but distinct functional needs. There will be different operators with different levels of skill and technical expertise, and each of them are facing different sourcing access opportunities and constraints. And so our research up to this point, as we're continuing with this work, suggests that disruption activities should be tailored accordingly. I know that we're concluding the end of our time. Everyone on this call has meetings and a full afternoon ahead of them. And I'm happy to give you a little bit of your time back. Really appreciate everyone's time for joining us. Again, if you have follow-up questions, if you'd like to receive some of our project reports as we're rolling them out, feel free to reach out to us directly at our email insight@unomaha.edu. We'll look forward to staying in touch. Take care. Thank you. And thank you, Suat and Joel, for this discussion.
Thank you.